Hey guys, Luke on Sean's channel. Today I'll be showcasing my Dragonmaid deck profile, or Maid Rulers, because it looks like the Dragon Rulers are back, and I think that the archetype itself complements this deck beautifully. So without further ado, let's not beat around the bush. This is Dragon Maids or Maid Rulers. Starting things off, we have 3 copies of Chamber Dragonmaid. Now, for those of you not familiar with the gimmick of Dragonmaid, what Dragonmaids do basically is they have the primary effect when they're normal special summoned, but also they have a secondary effect that they can, at the start of battle phase, they can bounce back into your hand and then special summon a Dragonmaid monster from your hand or graveyard with a higher level than the one that they are. Those higher level Dragonmaids are usually the level 7 or level 8, but it'll specify in the card. Chamber is very powerful, and the only small Dragonmaid will run at 3. In fact, it's the only Dragonmaid run at 3 because she has the most useful effect that if this card is normal or special summoned, you can add 1 Dragonmaid spell trap card from your deck to your hand, which is just an easy search for the deck where you're able to get your changeover, your fusion spell, your tidying, your bit of trap removal, or even the hospitality as well. So 3 copies of Chamber I find to be essential for this build. I run 2 copies of Parlor. Parlor, I played around with putting her at 3, and you know what, if you're on a budget with some of these cards in here, yeah, you can absolutely put her to 3, but I find just for consistency, putting her at 2 is absolutely fine. Parlor's effect, when she's normal special summon, you can send 1 Dragonmaid card from your deck to the graveyard, except for herself. The reason why this is so good and very powerful is because you can send any Dragonmaid card at all. So Changeover actually has an effect while it's in the graveyard. There's actually a very easy combo you can do to go into your Sheou. Say you have Parlor Dragonmaid and a dragon with an level 5 or higher dragon monster in your hand. What you can do is you can normal summon Parlor, you can activate her effect, you can dump the Changeover, use Changeover and Grave to bounce a Parlor back to your hands, and then add the Changeover back to your hands, and then boom, you have all the materials to activate Changeover to go into your Sheou. The reason why I run her at 2 and Chamber at 3 is because Chamber can actually add it straight to her hand, where we're not at risk to decrow or other ways our opponent can interrupt us getting her fusion spell. So only 2 copies of Parlor is more than enough for this build. We run 2 copies of Kitchen Dragonmaid. Kitchen's great, she's pretty much a weaker Parlor, so when she's normal or special summoned, you can add 1 Dragonmaid monster from your deck to your hand. Except for herself, then you send 1 Dragonmaid monster from your hand to the graveyard. This is good if you're kind of like digging deeper into your deck to get the big Dragonmaids to your hand and then discard into the graveyard, so you have your battle phase set up when you're doing their secondary effects at the start of battle phase. I went in between running Kitchen at 1 or 2, but I think 2 is more than enough for this build. I wouldn't recommend you run at 3 at all. I think 2 is the optimal amount that you should play it at. 1 copy of Nurse. Honestly, I wasn't using Nurse at all in this build until Redox got unbanned. So now Redox at 1, we want some Earth attribute synergy in order for it to complement Redox a lot better. So 1 copy of Nurse. The Nurse still has a powerful effect that if this card is normal or special summoned, you can target 1 level 4 lower Dragonmaid in your graveyard, except for Nurse and special summon it, which is really good. If you bring out Nurse while Chamber's in the graveyard, you can use Nurse's effect to bring back Chamber onto the field, and then Chamber can get you an ad from there, or pretty much any way that you can take advantage of the other maid cards that way. It's still pretty good, so definitely Nurse running at 1 I find to be optimal in this build. I'll just breeze through. The only 2 big Dragon Rulers that we run this build is Tinkhec and Lorpar. Lorpar is the bigger version of Parlor, and Tinkhec is the bigger version of Kitchen. I like them both. They're both 2700 big beat sticks, are both level 8, which is really good. However, they both have other effects, so it's pretty much the opposite to the Dragonmaids. To the small Dragonmaids, what they do is at the end of battle phase, what you can do is actually you can return them to the hand, and then you can special summon a level 3 Dragonmaid monster from your hand, which isn't as powerful as what the other Dragonmaids do, but it's still pretty good. They also have their own abilities too, which are quite good. Lorpar, you can discard this card and target 1 face-up monster on the field. Players can activate that target's effects on the field this turn, which is a very powerful effect, but unfortunately it's not a quick effect, so it's not as good as it could have been. But what I really like Tinkhec for is he actually has a quick effect, which is pretty much a funny version of Collude for Dragonmaids. What this does is you can discard Tinkhec to the graveyard, target 1 Dragonmaid you control, it gains 2000 attack at the end of this turn. It's a nice little damage step shenanigans. Honestly, I think this is the optimal ratio. If you're going to run any more of either of them, maybe run an extra copy of Tinkhec, but I think 1 and 1 more than enough for this build. Besides, we need to make room for other big powerful dragons in this build as well, which, speaking of which, we now have Tempest, Blaster, and Redox. So 3 Dragon Rulers are now back, newly limited to 1. I really love the Dragon Rulers. I cannot wait to see how this deck benefits when Title is eventually unbanned, because we all know it's coming. The Dragon Rulers are back. Spellbook of Judgment is back to 3, so why not the Dragon Rulers? For those of you who don't know the Dragon Rulers, they were really powerful. Really powerful dragons that the original intention seemed to be that Blaster can go in any fire decks, Tempest go in any wind, Redox go in any earth decks, and then Title go in any water decks. But figures out that all these monsters together in their own form of deck actually ended up being pretty good in itself. So Dragon Rulers was a really powerful deck when it was first released at the time in Lord of the Tachyon Galaxy. But for those of you who don't know what they do, I'll pretty much briefly explain why they're here in this deck. The reason why I think Dragon Rulers complement Dragonmaid so much is because of all the different attributes. Of course, we already know that Parlor is a wind, so it complements Tempest, Kitchen is a fire to complement Blaster, and now Nurse is an earth to complement Title. So each of these rulers have a different effect if you discard itself and one other monster of their same attribute to the graveyard. For example, Blaster, you can discard this card and one fire monster to the graveyard, tear one card in the field and destroy it. Nice bit of pop. Tempest, you can discard this card and one wind monster to the graveyard, add one dragon monster from your deck to your hand, which is really good at pretty much searching any dragon in the whole deck with Tempest. And now Redox, fresh at 1. You can discard this card and one earth monster to the graveyard, target one monster in your graveyard and special summon that target. All these are absolutely great. And these Dragon Rulers are very easy to bring out, because what you need to do with any of them is you can banish a total of 2 of their attribute and or dragon type monsters from your hand or graveyard, and then special summon them. And that could be an effect that happens while they're in your hand or in the graveyard, which is really good. Granted, I don't think Dragon Rulers are going to be as powerful now or as much as a problem now as they were when they were first released, but I still think that it's really cool that we actually can play Dragon Rulers in a deck that complements it very well and use dragons to their full potential. So I'm really happy to say that we are able to run 1 copy of Blaster, 1 Tempest, and 1 Redox in this build. Now all we have to do is wait for Title to be unbanned. Definitely recommend running the Dragon Rulers. It's honestly one of the main reasons to play Dragonmaids now. Funny how we're like boasting about how good the Dragon Rulers are, but we actually have more powerful dragons in this deck as well. We also run 1 copy of Bystial Druiswurm, 1 copy of Bystial Magnamhut, 1 copy of Saronir, and 1 copy of Baldrake. I think Bystials are too powerful to not play in this build, because not only are Bystials powerful monsters in themselves that have very powerful effect, but also they actually work as a bit of disruption, considering that a bunch of decks nowadays, they're pretty much all light and dark builds. What Bystials are able to do, they actually banish 1 light or 1 dark monster from either graveyard in order to special summon them out, which of course is great disruption for like the likes of Geist Strikers, Unchained, and everything like that, but they also have pretty powerful effects on their own as well. Magnamhut is actually at 1 right now, and the reason for that is that it has a powerful effect that if this card is special summoned, during the end phase of this turn, you can add 1 dragon monster from your deck to your hand, which is really powerful, because we basically just search our deck for whatever we want, much like Tempest itself. Druiswurm is pretty powerful as well. If this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, you can target 1 special summon monster your opponent controls and send it to the graveyard. Saronir probably the least powerful. We're not playing the Bystial Rebellion in order to make this Bystial build, but Saronir is able to Bystial monster from her deck to the graveyard. And Baldrake, who I think is underrated, has an effect that if your opponent special summons a Ritual, Fusion, Synchro, Xyz, or Link monster, you contribute 1 other light or dark monster, then target 1 of those special summon monsters and banish it. So of course all these dragons are all these Bystials are very good, and they serve their purpose in this deck. They're great interruption, they're great removal. I think Bystials are definitely important to run at least 1 each. I kind of played around with having the Bystial Rebellion, but I feel like when you're putting in the Bystial Rebellion in this build, you kind of need to pump Saronir up to more. And I really don't want to taint this deck and take it away from the fact that it is a Dragonmaid Dragon Ruler build. So I think only a small Bystial engine is what's kind of keeping it somewhat pure. But if you really want to lean heavily into making this more and more competitive, maybe you can up the Bystials a bit more, than change around the ratios of my build. But this is what I'm rocking with right now. I'm trying to make this build somewhat competitive, so I run 3 copies of Ash Blossom in this build. Ash Blossom is great because, as everyone knows, it's probably the most universal hand trap. Also, the fact that it's a fire complements Blaster a lot, because we're able to use Blaster's effect, discarding itself and Ash Blossom in order to pop a card in the field. But not only that, another hand trap that complements our Dragon Rulers really well is Droll and Lockbird. The fact that it is a wind, we are able to use it with Tempest and discard Tempest and itself to the graveyard in order to search a dragon, which is just really good synergy. The fact that the staples themselves are able to complement this deck in order to pop off their own effects is really broken. So I think 3 copies of Ash Blossom, 3 copies of Droll is very important for this build. And finally, just rounding off the hand traps or the monsters in this build, 2 copies of Effect Veiler. You can run 3 if you want, but this deck is 40 cards and I want to like stick it to 40 cards strictly as I can, so only 2 copies of Effect Veiler in this build. I think if you add the extra one, the deck goes up to 41 cards, and I just don't think it helps the consistency too well. Moving on to our spells and traps now. 1 copy of Dragonmaid Changeover. This is a fusion spell of Dragonmaids. You can fusion summon 1 Dragon Fusion monster from your extra deck using monsters from your hand or field as fusion material. But also, while this card is in the graveyard, you can target 1 Dragonmaid monster you control, add this card to your hand, and if you do, return that monster to your hand. So as I mentioned earlier, this is very good when you're doing your Parlor play in order to go into your Sheou. I don't think there's a necessity to run any more than just 1 Changeover, so I think 1 of it is absolutely fine. Be very careful that this does not get DD Crow. That would be very bad for us because we can't go into our main boss monster of Sheou. But that's why we have Bystials and Dragon Rulers in this build, so that Sheou is not our only boss monster of this build of this deck anymore. 2 copies of Hospitality. Don't run it at 3, it can be a bit of a brick. What Hospitality does is you special summon 1 Dragonmaid monster from your hand or graveyard into defense position, then you can send 1 Dragonmaid monster with the same attribute but a different level from your deck to the graveyard. Good way of setting up if you're kind of going for your Dragonmaid plays. However, this deck can be pretty much a brick if you don't have a Dragonmaid monster in your hand or graveyard. That's why I don't run it at 3 at all. I think 2 is more than enough. If you want to run it at 1 and put in the extra Effect Veiler, that's absolutely fine. I completely understand. But it's just because this can be searched off of a chamber, so it's not a necessity to run at 3. We run 3 copies of Super Poly. Super Poly is actually really good for this build. Well, Super Poly is pretty good anyways because it is probably the most heavy hitting board breaker. The fact that neither player can respond to this. What Super Poly does, discard 1 card, fusion 1 fusion monster from your extra deck using monsters from either field as fusion material. Of course, we have the 3 main Super Poly targets in the extra deck as well, so running Super Poly in the main deck, definitely not an issue at all. This can also be sided out if your opponent's playing a pretty weird deck that's able to kind of play around Super Poly, so I find main decking it to be absolutely fine. But depending on the matchup, you might want to side this out. We want some draw power, so 3 copies of Pot Prosperity I find to be the most powerful pot card in the entire game. What this card does is you can banish 3 or 6 cards of your choice from the extra deck face down, then for the rest of this turn, after this card resolves, any damage your opponent takes is halved. Also, you excavate cards from the top of your deck equal to the number of cards banished and add 1 excavated card. Then you place the rest on the bottom of your deck in any order. This is absolutely crazy. With the Dragonmaids themselves, all the small ones are pretty much their own starter. So you don't need to be going crazy playing Extravagance or Desires in order to draw 2 blindly. If you're able to have the knowledge of what's coming up next with your Prosperity, you pretty much only need the 1 card anyways. Also, there isn't an overly reliance on the extra deck, so the fact that we're able to pick and choose some cards that we're able to banish means that this card complements this deck really well. Also, I definitely play this over Extravagance because we already run 2 Sheou and 2 House in our extra deck now because of Prosperity. If you're running Extravagance, you might want to change the ratios in the extra deck. Yeah, this is a control deck anyway, so the fact that the damage your opponent takes is half doesn't really affect us. We're not going for big OTKs. This deck mostly does control, so 3 copies of Prosperity I find to be absolutely perfect for this build. I run 1 copy of Goldstark. Goldstark is great because the Dragon Rulers also have effects when they're banished. Yes, the Dragon Rulers do have more effects. So when you activate Goldstark and you banish any one of your Dragon Rulers, what they actually have is an effect when they're banished. You can add a 1 Dragon type monster from your deck to your hand of the same attribute of the Dragon Ruler that you banished. That's why we run the Nurse, just because there are certain situations where Nurse is very helpful that you're able to Goldstark, banish your Redox, and straight up search your Nurse. Most time when we're going with this play, Goldstark is good for getting rid of Tempest in order to search for a Parlor, which is definitely a really good starter for us. But also the fact that Goldstark gets you that card you banished after 2 standby phases. After 2 of your standby phases after the activation is just really good. It's definitely run Goldstark at 1 in this build. This deck does a lot of stuff, so 1 copy of Call by the Grave, I think is a good way for us not to get interrupted, but also the fact that we're able to interrupt our opponent's plays itself with Call by the Grave, definitely run at 1 this build. Call by is definitely one of these cards I definitely play in pretty much every deck I ever build. We run 2 copies of Tidying. Tidying is a really good trap card that was made for Dragonmaids in mind. What this card does is on activation, you can target 1 dragon monster you control and 1 card your opponent controls or into graveyard and return to the hand. which of course is a good bit of disruption, but also the fact that we're able to bounce our Dragonmaids back to the hand means we can trigger a house to destroy or whatever. It also gives a good hand advantage anyways. But also this card's secondary effect while it's in the graveyard is that you can banish this card and then special one Dragonmaid monster from your hand or graveyard into defense position, but return to hand during the end phase. So of course, as you know, that's just crazy in itself because you're able to get your Dragonmaid effects to pop off just by banishing this card. So definitely run Tidying at 2. I ran at 3 for so long, but now that I was making space for our other engines such as the Bystials and Dragon Rulers, I think 2 is more than enough, especially because we're also able to search it off of our chamber. Last 2 cards, 2 copies of Solemn Strike. I just really like Solemn Strike. I was always playing Strike in this build. If you want to change it for Imperm, that's absolutely fine. I don't blame you at all. But I think Strike is just really good because Strike in itself can pretty much stop your opponents completely in their tracks, and there's not an awful lot of ways that they can get around that. What Strike does is when a monster will be special summoned or a monster effect is activated, pay 1500 life points, negate the summoner activation if you do destroy the card. I just find for this build itself, I really prefer running Strike over Imperm. It might make a bit more sense when you take a look at the side deck, but definitely just to round off this build, I run 2 copies of Strike. Going into the extra deck now, we run 2 copies of Sheou and 2 copies of House. I definitely think for every copy of Sheou you run, you should have another copy of House. Sheou is the main boss monster for this build. He's really good. What you need to go into him is 1 Dragonmaid monster and 1 level 5 or higher Dragon monster. Not necessarily needs to be a Dragonmaid, level 5 or higher Dragonmaid monster, so you can use your Bystials or your Dragon Rulers in order to go into him. Sheou is a quick effect Omni Negate. It's just when your opponent activates a card or effect, you can quick effect negate activation if you destroy the card, and also after that return this card to the extra deck, and if you do, special summon 1 House Dragonmaid from your extra deck. Great Omni Negate, that's why I think running 1 house for every 1 Sheou you run this build is very much essential. That's why I run 2 copies of Sheou and 2 copies of House. But not only does Sheou have an Omni Negate, what it also does is that during each standby phase, you can special summon 1 level 9 or lower Dragonmaid monster from your hand or graveyard, which is absolutely crazy because if you use the effect of one of your Dragonmaid monsters on your turn in order to set up and bring out Sheou, what you're able to do is when it's going over to your opponent's turn, during the standby phase, you can special summon out that Dragonmaid monster again and use their effect again during your opponent's turn. Absolutely great. I definitely think Sheou is the main boss monster of this build. The fact that it's 3500 attack as well is absolutely crazy. Definitely run at least 2. I did run at 3 when I was running Extravagance in this build, but now that Prosperity is more affordable than what it was, I think only running at 2 now to make space for other things that we can take advantage of in the extra deck is more than enough. Now of course House is very good on its own. You can actually bring out House without having to go through the Sheou thing first by just fusion summoning her using 1 Dragonmaid monster and 1 Dragon monster as well, which can be any monster, any Dragon monster at all. It doesn't really matter about the level. Most of the time you're bringing House out just after using Shell's effect. But I still think House Dragonmaid is the one to be overlooked just because she has the effect that once per turn during the standby phase, you can target 1 other Dragonmaid monster you control and special summon 1 Dragonmaid monster from your hand or graveyard in defense position whose level is 1 higher or 1 lower than it. So say if we have Chamber on the field and then during the standby phase we have House to activate her effect as well, what that can actually do is special summon a level 3 from her hand or graveyard, which of course can be her kitchen or her parlor. Also House has the effect that's not once per turn that when another face of Dragon monster you control returns to the hand, except during the damage step, target 1 monster your opponent controls and destroy it. And that effect is not once per turn. And considering the amount of times our Dragonmaid monsters bounce back to the hand, whether it be their own battle phase effect or by the effect of Tidying, House is very good to get at least 2 pops every turn if we're setting up right. So 2 copies of Sheou and 2 copies of House I find to be absolutely perfect for this build. As aforementioned, we run the 3 Super Poly targets because we main deck Super Poly. If we side out Super Poly, you can also just like banish these cards off Prosperity as well. It doesn't really matter. But the main reason we use them is just because Super Poly is one hell of a card. Mudragon the Swamp, what it takes in order to go into it is 2 monsters with the same attribute but different types. What Garura does is 2 monsters with the same type and attribute but different names, which of course a lot of decks have meet that criteria. And also Starry Venom Fusion Dragon, just 2 dark monsters are on the field except tokens. We don't use them for any other effects other than the fact that they are Super Poly targets, but one thing I will say, Garura is definitely the best of the lot, just because if Garura is sent to the graveyard, we actually get to draw a card. So that's the ratio I run in the extra deck. We have the links now to round things off. I run 2 copies of Heraldic Seal of Heavenly Spheres. Spheres needs 2 dragon monsters and then once per opponent's turn. If this card is in the extra monster zone, you can quick effect, tribute 1 monster from your hand or field and return 1 face-up card in the field to the hand. Also, if this card is tributed, you can special summon 1 dragon monster from your hand or deck but makes attack and defense 0. That doesn't negate their effect, so it's really good interruption during your opponent's turn that you're able to tribute this card and then bring out one of your Dragonmaids and get their effect from there. So 2 copies of Spheres I find to be very good for the build. I run 1 copy of Dark. Dark needs 2 monsters, including a Dark monster to go into him, but pretty much all of our Bystials are Dark monsters anyways. I think it's really good if we have the option to steal one of our opponent's problematic monsters that we destroyed from the graveyard and use it against them. So I think Dark is definitely really good for this build. Unfortunately, we don't have the second effect, like what Sky Strikers or other decks can take advantage of, that if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can add 1 Dark monster from 1500 or less defense from your deck to your hand, because unfortunately Chamber's defense is 1800. But I still think Dark is worth running in this build. If you want to change it up and use something else, that's absolutely fine. I think Dark's pretty good, but also we also need to have like some of not necessarily the greatest cards in order to banish off our prosperity. 1 copy of IP Masquerena. Masquerena is really good. For those of you who don't know, IP Masquerena is a good link monster to go into if you have the opportunity to link something during your opponent's turn and get some disruptions from there. So 1 copy of IP. 2 of the main Nightmare cards, we have Phoenix and Unicorn. Funnily enough, only noticing now, Phoenix is actually a fire, so that complements our Dragon Rulers as well, which I find to be very good. Unicorn is the link tree. When this card is linked summon, discard 1 card, target 1 card on the field and return to the deck. This is a really good target to go into using your IP because it's a good interruption during your opponent's turn. Also Phoenix, this card is linked summon, you can discard 1 card, target 1 spell, trap your opponent controls and destroy it. So I definitely think both these Nightmare monsters are worth running in the build. Rounding things off, this deck doesn't have a whole lot of effect negation. Maybe if you want to run the Imperm, go ahead, that's no problem at all. So I think what's arguably one of the most powerful effect negation is Apollousa. Apollousa is a link 4, but it gains 800 attack times the number of link materials used for its summon. And then what happens with Apollousa is that once per chain, when your opponent activates a monster effect, you can quick effect. You can make this card lose 800 attack, and if you do, negate the activation, which I find to be very powerful, so definitely run Apollousa at 1. Then finally, rounding off, you can use Access Code, but because this is a Dragon deck, I find it to be really cool that we can actually bring back Borrelsword Dragon. Borrelsword Dragon is a really good OTK enabler. It's a link 4, and it cannot be destroyed by battle, which is really powerful, considering it has 3000 attack. But also, there's sometimes the Borrelsword Dragon can attack twice, because once per turn, it can quick effect, target 1 attack position monster, and change to defense position. And this card can make a second attack during each battle phase's turn, which is an activated effect that your opponent cannot activate cards or effects in response to that activation. So I definitely think Borrelsword Dragon is definitely worth running in this build. We're going to round things off with the side deck now. Now, I want to just present to you 3 different kaijus that you can run in this build, or even if you want to run 1 of each, that's absolutely fine. Reason why I'm pointing out these 3 is just because if you look at their attributes, one being earth, wind, and fire, they can actually complement some of your Dragon Rulers in this build as well. In fact, one thing I will suggest, the fact that you don't run an awful lot of earth monsters in this build anyways, whereas Droll and Ash complements both of these 2, maybe running Kumongous might be worthwhile a bit more just to have some more earth monsters in your build in order to get the full effect off your Redox. But honestly, it's completely down to you. Storm Winds is no longer an issue, so you can absolutely run Garura if you want. But I definitely think running a playset of the 1 kaiju, or even if you want to run 1 of each in this build, is absolutely fine. I just wanted to point that out to you really quickly. But I think personally, I'd probably run 3 Kumongouses in this build just to up our earth count to get the full effect off of Redox. Because we already have Ash and Droll for Tempest and Blaster, so they don't really need a boost as much as Redox does. So 3 copies of any kaiju you're choosing. I run 3 copies of Dark Ruler No More on the side. Dark Ruler is really good going second card, just because it's spell speed 4, so not a lot can respond to it. But what it basically does is negate the effects of all face-up monsters your opponent currently controls until the end of this turn. Also, for the rest of this turn, after this card resolves, your opponent takes no damage, which is really the only one downside to pretty much negate every monster your opponent currently controls, pretty much stop their huge unbreakable board, so that you're able to pop off and play the game. So 3 copies of Dark Ruler No More I think is definitely very good to run the side, definitely a going second card. So 3 copies of it I find to be absolutely great. Speed of going second cards, 3 copies of Evenly Matched. Evenly Matched, absolutely great board breaker, and Dark Ruler No More complements it so well, so definitely if we're going second, the ideal hand would be Dark Ruler No More and Evenly Matched, so run 3 of each in your side deck. Finally, getting into the final bit of the side deck, it's a bit floodgatey, and that's perfect if we're going into game 3 where we're able to go first I think there's a lot of different ways you can play this deck. If you want to go down the Dragonmaid route for game 3, some great cards you can play are Summon Limit. Considering this deck doesn't summon an awful lot as much as other decks such as like Branded or Unchained, I think Summon Limit is a good side deck option just because it's one of these annoying cards not really a lot of people look out for. And I think it's definitely worthwhile for going into game 3. So 3 copies of Summon Limit in the side. And then finally, Sean's going to hate this, but 3 copies of Anti-Spell Fragrance in the side I find to be very, very good as well. We don't overly rely on spells. In fact, if anything, monster effects is the main thing that we use in this build. So I think the Anti-Spell Fragrance is just really, really good in itself. It's good for oppressing our opponent even more, considering that this is a control deck at the end of the day. And we're able to pop off with all of our monster effects, is why I definitely think Anti-Spell Fragrance is worthwhile to run the side. And that pretty much concludes our deck. So that concludes the deck. Please let me know what you think. I'm really happy with the way it turned out. I can't wait for Tile to come back. I think Dragon Rulers are definitely back in a big way, especially in this deck. So please let me know what you guys think. If you guys build any variants or any things you guys would like to switch out, please let me know in the comments. But overall, I'm very, very happy with this build. I think you guys should try it out too. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel because there's plenty more deck profiles on the way, and we'll see you guys next time.